So before we actually get to New Frontier, I kind of want to talk about what led us here today. So last season, we spoke. Mike is really engrossed in New Frontier. We were trying to do the episode
I love
here.
this comic.
He can't stop reading it.
Such a good story.
We have it in front of us. We have the Absolute Edition tabbed with Mike's notes here. The other way that alternate realities continues to live on, because Mike once again is pouring through these New Frontier pages.
It's so good.
And so in addition to being a book club, I guess Alternate Realities is also still a dinner group. Mike, are you with me? You're like all over the place here. What's going on?
I'm waiting.
You're like on your phone. You're reading the book.
This is what we were talking about being at work. Like I'm a multitasker. I'm like listening to you.
But I'm trying to set you up for something. You're not with me.
I am with you. Believe me. You're going to switch back. You're going to say, "How do you feel about that?" I'm going to have an entire thing ready to go.
Jesus, thank God he's not a surgeon. Jeez.
No.
For me, it was something that I read as it was coming out, and I enjoyed it from the start. And Rich, I think you had a similar experience. Something's happened here to the Absolute. I don't know what.
I'm wiping off a little bit of my lunch because I was really excited to speak with this about Rich Roney, and apparently I got a bunch of crap on it. Anyone who knows me knows I don't take particularly good care of my comics, but I noticed this here, and it's going to bother me if I don't get rid of it.
For those who don't know,
sorry,
Mike,
Anthony.
This is par for the course today. And then he finds out about kryptonite, and I don't want to give too much away, but his reaction to what, Mike? What are you doing?
Nothing. Sorry.
Like, what the hell?
I'm not used to sitting still for this long. You told me I couldn't flip through my books. I got distracted by my shirt. I'm sorry.
You did want a little levity and humor and laughter.
Not at my expense so much, but I guess I'll take it.
He beats us when you guys are not listening, by the way. We cut those out.
Welcome to My Comic Shop History. I am your host, Anthony Desiato, and this is the first edition of the Alternate Realities Book Club. I'm really excited to do this slightly different version of the podcast. We've been talking a lot about collecting over the past few episodes, and we're going to touch on that a little bit in this episode, but for the most part, this is going to be a little bit of a break in the action as we do some really serious but also fun comic book talk. So I want to introduce the rest of my book club. To my right, we have the legendary Rich Roney. Rich, say hello.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody.
You got to speak for this to work.
Auditory media.
Yeah, they're so audience drive me nuts.
And then we have a couple other gentlemen on the other side of the table. Mr. Phil Hussain, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
And then next to you, Phil, we have Mr. Mike Sangregorio.
Hello, everyone.
We are recording today at Aw Yeah Comics in Harrison, New York. Mark and the rest of the Aw Yeah crew very graciously allowed us to take over the back studio room here and set up, and we're really grateful to be able to do this here. Phil, would you like to do the honors? Tell us what we're going to be discussing today.
Sure. We're going to be discussing DC: The New Frontier by Darwyn Cooke. It came out in early 2000s, a retro telling of the DC characters, which, in my opinion, was a fantastic read. Second time around.
I guess on that note, let's get into the story here. For anyone who hasn't read New Frontier who's listening to this, I think you could still follow along. I would imagine a lot of people, it's a classic story, very popular. I imagine a lot of people have already read it. If you haven't, while you don't need to have read it for the purposes of listening to this episode, I highly encourage it, and I would imagine that the rest of you would as well. It's a terrific story. Whether you read the book or you watch the movie or you do both, I really think you'll get a lot out of it and enjoy it. By way of recap, what the story is about. So the story chronicles the formation of the Justice League and the dawn of the Silver Age of comics. It is set in the 1950s, which is different than most modern comics. So it places these characters in their proper historical context. So the story takes place during the period of time when these characters' early adventures were being published. So it's set in post-war America. We've now entered the Cold War. There's a lot of paranoia. The government is trying to root out subversive influences. The previous generation of costumed heroes, the mystery men, they have all been forced into retirement or they've been captured. And really the only Golden Age heroes who remain are Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. Batman's operating as an outlaw. Superman and Wonder Woman are basically doing these clandestine operations for the government. They're not the leaders and the sources of inspiration that they will become and that they need to become. And while that's going on, a new threat is rising, which we come to learn is the Center. And it's infecting people throughout the world with doubt and fear and despair. And a new generation, a new wave of heroes, Flash, Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter, many others, must rise and become the heroes that we need and dispatch this threat. And so that, it's a sprawling epic. It's very expansive. It touches on virtually every corner of the DC universe.
It took every character that was published basically in 1959 or 1960 and wove it into one single 380-page story.
Yeah, the best part about New Frontier, or rather, one of my favorite aspects of it, is that it's essentially a crossover that could have happened at the time. There's nothing in here that contradicts what comics were actually being published at the end of the 50s. It's almost as if you took everything that was coming out during like the fifth week of publishing, if we think about it in modern terms, and said, oh, they're all going to fight the Center, who's going to be gone by the end of the story, so that's why the Justice League didn't have to fight him when they started the month after. So to Rich's point, I mean, from a continuity point of view, there's nothing in here that doesn't fit in with what we've known, but at the same time, the recontextualization and the appreciation for this material, I mean, this is my introduction to more than half the DC universe, and it's a heck of a ride.
I mean, personally for me, I look at it that, they're telling stories from the 50s, the good old days. But in my opinion, when they would publish these stories back in those days, they would keep it very wholesome, good. But what this is doing is tackling the reality. It tackles like the McCarthy trials. It's tackling civil rights. And, it's showing you the darker things that they would never publish in the 50s. So it's going back and saying, hey, you thought these were the good old days. Guess what? There's a darker aspect in the social economic conditions that they did not address, which is why, to me, this is why it clicked more for me now.
Clearly, all of this was by design by the project's creator, the writer and artist, Darwyn Cooke, who, very sadly passed away recently. I told a little story about him a few episodes ago, but, I mean, this work that he has done is just absolutely incredible.
I just want to quote something really quick. From The Absolute, there's an afterword by Darwyn, and in it, he kind of comments on the idea of these being set in the better days. And again, I'm 31. I have no nostalgia for the 50s. But he says, he's talking about an interaction with a fan, and he says, if you're bracing for speech number whatever about how those were the better days, relax. It wasn't the times or the place or the cultural comforts of the era. It was something you can find anywhere at any time. And then he says it was the earnest faith of youth. And that's from Darwyn in 2005, and I think that kind of summarizes what we're trying to say. He wasn't just like fetishizing this period that he may have remembered or may have read about. This was like, why did we care? He took it a step further, and he really made an incredible work of art because of it.
I read it as it was coming out. I enjoyed it a lot. Rich, I think you probably had somewhat of a similar experience. I was interested to learn, though, that, Mike and Phil, you guys were not immediately taken with it. I'll toss it to you first, Phil. What were your initial impressions of New Frontier? And how did you read it initially? How did you come across it?
I read originally as the first trade came out, so didn't read, the second one. It just didn't feel like, it didn't click with me. It felt like, maybe it was being a child, being a young kid, not understanding the meaning of patience, letting things build, let simmer. So I just read it and I was like, oh, it's just a little bit of off one takes of, different origin stories. I'm not sure what's happening. Hey, even, Green Lantern, Hal Jordan hasn't even turned into Green Lantern. What's going on? So maybe it was just, not appreciating it, not having a mature sense. But going back to it now, I reread the same thing. And I realized, wow, this is a build-up. This is what happens. You want to tell a good story, you need to have the foundation. But, 7 years later when I read it again, it just clicked. It just made sense from that perspective. So yes, I've appreciated it now rather than when it did in the past.
And I welcome your thoughts, but when as this was coming out, I was very excited because Hal Jordan is one of my 5 favorite characters. And I heard this being built up as, hey, this is going to be the origin story of Hal Jordan by Darwyn Cooke. So I was really looking forward to it. But and Anthony, I welcome your thoughts. The very first part of this, the very first one on Dinosaur Island, when I read that, I did have some doubts. I wondered, like, where is this going? Because it was so slow, and the characters really didn't capture me. But then, fortunately, this thing builds. It's more of a larger, sprawling, cohesive story. But I remember at the end of the first one, I was scratching my head a little bit. The very first book.
Yeah, it's definitely a bold choice to. I feel like maybe this could be a tough sell to begin with. A DC superhero story set in the 50s, and to kick it off with this lengthy sequence featuring the losers.
A 64-page.
Yeah, featuring the losers on Dinosaur Island. It was a little risky. Cook acknowledges that, though, in the annotations to this. He was well aware that it was, somewhat of a bold choice to start that way. But, yeah, I think once you get to the end of it and you see how it all ties together and, the nature of heroism and how our heroes have changed and all of that, it does make sense. One other question that I had for you, Phil, as I was rereading this, and I lost track of how many times I've read it now at this point. I want to say this was at least 5. I feel like I've read it at least a handful of times. But as I was reading it this time, Phil, and prepping for this episode and thinking about what we were going to be talking about and who I was going to be talking to, I thought of you because, you were not born in America. Mm-mm. And this story is very, quote unquote, American. Certainly, as you guys were getting at before, it doesn't shy away from the areas where this country has struggled.
Right.
The whole John Henry Irons sequence in particular, or John Wilson. But it's still very much about what America can be and the ideals that, we aspire to. So as someone who wasn't born here, I mean, what was your take on that, reading it?
I mean, I'll be honest with me, on the side stories, the John Irons one was the one that clicked more with me in terms of just the civil rights. A man being persecuted because of the color of his skin, his family killed, and him getting betrayed at the end by that child. To me, it was just, you hear about it from another country, coming from Pakistan, where I'm from, the land of opportunities, things of that nature, and how there's this painted picture that you are envisioned as a child growing up in another country. And you come here, and then you see the dark side of things, So it's not like, but it's also the spirit of the American people. It's learning, staying positive and pushing on. Life gives you lemons, you make lemonades. So the kind of feeling made me happy when I read it. Like, it was always, you have a conflict. You're not going to hide away from it. You're going to have issues. Hal Jordan had PTSD. I mean, you can tell he was scared after when he was telling the guy, he forgot how to say in Korean, the war is over. And when he's in the helicopter, he starts speaking, and that's the only thing he can say. It's just all those things where it's like you see the humanity in people. And in America, you see the various issues that most other countries don't have because they don't have the diversity. And that's why I think that's what makes this book so great, is that it gives you the American spirit. But it's not just the good stuff. It's not sugarcoating it. It's showing the conflicts. But at the end of the day, we always come through at the end together as people. So that's what I loved about it.
Rich, you have an interesting perspective as well. So we mentioned how you just turned 60. So when did you start reading comics? What time period are we talking here?
Oh, I guess probably, quite frankly, just about this time. Probably about 1962 was when I started reading. And what for me was tremendous, and I know you want to talk about the story, but let me talk about when I met Darwyn Cooke and what that was like.
Yeah, absolutely. Just by way of setup. So we've gotten at this a couple times before in the podcast, especially last season. You've had a number of encounters with certain comic book creators. You've visited Mark Waid numerous occasions at different comic book conventions, always wearing the same attire, so
yes.
he can't forget you.
That's correct. And he might even listen, since he's one of the owners of All Yeah. He might.
That would be great if he listened.
Hi, Mark.
You also had a run-in with DC artist Shane Davis, where you kind of accosted him at the laundromat or the bagel store.
The bagel store.
No, you didn't accost him.
When does that restraining order expire? Are we there yet? Does this violate anything in particular?
But you saw him, you recognized him, you shook his hand, and he was a little taken aback. But then you explained that you had someone in common, Brandon Montclair, DC editor, comic book creator.
Shane calmed down then. I might have come at him a little fast.
Yeah. So, concluding the trilogy of Rich Roney meets comic book creators, what was your encounter with Darwyn Cooke like?
I got to it was absolutely tremendously pleasant and enjoyable on all levels. At the same time that Parker, the first book of Parker, started coming out, I had gone to Heroes Con with Drew and Tom, and it was the Friday of Heroes Con. It was tremendously empty and open, so it was the Friday before. And around noon, I saw Darwyn Cooke sitting completely by himself at one of the tables. And I bought one of the books, and I carried one with me, but I had two of them signed by him. But we had a tremendously, I'd say for about 20 minutes, we just spoke, just no foreordained script or agenda. But one of the things I told him was, I said I enjoyed his work, and I said I especially enjoyed this because I think I'm about 7 years older than Darwyn Cooke, but I grew up during the very time he was setting this story, the chronology in the early 1960s. And I said to him, I got to tell you, I grew up in this time. This reminds me so much of Project Mercury. I can remember when I was like 6 years old, my mother and I were in our living room. We were watching John Glenn orbit the Earth the 3 times. It was huge. And he got very excited. He shot back. He said, you know how I pitched this? He said, I pitched this as The Right Stuff meets the JLA. So we spoke a lot about society at that time and the story he was trying to sell, and also how it was so consistent with the Kennedy era. Camelot, JFK, even as Kennedy's speech, the torch has been passed to a new generation. And I said I loved it because he really captured all the excitement and all the optimism of that time. When Kennedy was in office, it was tremendously optimistic. There was the Peace Corps. There were so many initiatives, the space race, Project Mercury, Project Apollo. So I said it captured that excitement, that optimism, and it was a tremendously enjoyable conversation. So much so that 3 days later, when Tom and I were going through the lobby of the hotel, we were trying to get on an elevator to go up to see Drew, and Darwyn was coming out of the elevator across the hall, but he remembered me. He was very, very excited. He said, "Hey guys, how's it going?" And it was a wonderfully pleasant conversation.
I'm glad that you were able to have that, that meeting with him, and that you were able to speak to him for as long as you did. Because oftentimes at these conventions, you see someone, it's just for a couple of minutes. You tell them you like their work, maybe you get something signed. But the fact that you were really able to have a discussion with him is really tremendous. And I guess going back, though, to my earlier question about, your perspective and all of this, as someone who read the exploits of these characters as they were originally being published around the time that, this story is set, I mean, I don't know, I guess, sort of what was your impression as you were reading New Frontier and seeing your characters in that light?
You had the big three, as Anthony said. You had Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. But from a craftsmanship standpoint, Cooke, he kind of sidelined them. He found ways to make sure they were not, they were removed at the very end when they fought the villain. And it gave Flash and Green Lantern and John Jones each a chance to step up. But throughout the base of the story, what I liked the most was it showed each of those three characters, Hal, Barry, and John, as they ceased being a civilian and took the very, very first steps to becoming a superhero. Each of them made that transition from civilian to hero. And I found that transition phase and that very beginning fascinating. No. Like even Barry's insecurity about meeting Superman, I thought was interesting.
Speaking of Superman.
Yeah, as Rich was saying that, we hear the Superman theme music playing. Once again, we are recording at an active comic shop, so if you hear anything in the background, that's what it is. I mean, you bring up really interesting points, and for me in particular, I mean, you guys all know, and at this point, I think most listeners know, Superman's my favorite character. So for me, it's a little tough to accept Superman's role in this because, again, his job is to inspire, but then to get out of the picture. It always makes me laugh, though. He has that great moment where he gives the speech to everybody.
Are you with me?
Are you with me? Everybody's still bickering, the government agents and the mystery men and all that. And he gets everybody united, and they're looking on, and he flies off, and he gets blasted by the center.
We're dead.
And that's it. And he's gone so quickly, but he has to be gone that quickly.
Yeah, they had to sideline him.
Right. And it was not his moment. It was the time for these other characters, but he did also still serve that very critical role of bringing them together. And throughout the story, when we do see Superman, he is struggling with his role. He's doing missions for the government, but he's not, again, the Superman that we know he'll become. And so he does have his own important arc, but it's in service of these other characters. So it's a little tricky for me as a Superman fan, but I appreciate it, and it works.
To that end, and to me, there's two groups of threes. You got Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. And then you got Hal, John, and Barry, right? two different generations to a degree. But what was fascinating, I thought, was the craftsmanship. He did the the black insignia, the whole Fleischer Superman. He did the Golden Age Batman, even with the purple gloves. But also, what was cool was the unique rendition of Wonder Woman. Taller than Superman, an Amazon. She was Conan. She's reveling in the victory in with the women over the oppressors. That was like Conan celebrating after a victory.
Her sword, like this is a version of Wonder Woman that has a sword and a shield, and she is a warrior. And there's two things that I always notice. She's always smiling. Diana is always shown smiling, regardless of what's going on. And it's beautiful. Everyone else is scowling, and it's because they're struggling with it. Diana is, in many ways, the inspirational figure in this. And it's just a beautiful recontextualization of that character. The second thing is her sword is dented. And I really, really connected with that, because this is that's like seeing Captain America's shield dented. And it's like, this is a magic weapon. This is something that she's carried into battle time and time again. And it just hints at other stories and other mythologies, and really just begs the question, like, what has Diana survived? What overwhelming threats has she gone through? And to see her stand next to all the various superheroes with this gear, it's just like, oh yeah, I understand why being around someone like that would make you want to kind of risk everything and fight the big threats. And I just thought she was so wonderfully well done here. And I think this is probably my favorite interpretation of Wonder Woman, and Darwyn Cooke's probably my favorite Wonder Woman writer, even though I think he's only written her about a dozen times. So I
think that's what stood out for me, was the Wonder Woman was probably the best written Wonder Woman I have read. I mean, the best thing in my opinion was when Superman goes to the Paradise Island where they're living, and she just has these amazing, like, maternal instinct advice that she gives. My favorite was when she says to him, "Cal, your real power lies not in your strength, but in your values and compassionate spirit." And it's just like, she's just able to hit it home that it's not his powers that make him the person. He is the sign of hope because of what his values are. And that's the most important thing. And one last thing, if I could say about the Wonder Woman, was, I hate going through this. Basically, it's in the special little one-off issue that they did, the classified, where it says, "For an Amazon, there's no greater deed than overcoming anger and conflict with love." Yes, she's an Amazonian. She battles, but you don't see that. You see her resolving anger and conflict with love. So that's the thing. Whereas, unfortunately, most modern Wonder Women are written as they're angry, man-hating, You don't see that. And you can also see it in the tribute at the end of the second volume. Look at how Darwyn Cooke approaches women. He says, at the end, "All others would like to thank my mom. Her love, determination, and strength set a powerful example for me and gave me the spirit to climb this mountain." So the authors themselves are contributing, writing positive women because they have this positive influence in their life.
Going back to what Phil said, if you're reading the classified issue, the one that's not in the absolute, she is responsible for putting together the world's finest team. And I love that, because if you're reading comics during the 50s, there's really no Justice Society, there's really no Justice League, there's no Marvel Comics yet. But you have these three characters who were the representation of superheroes when the entire genre was, not very popular. And to see Darwyn look at the three of them and say, well, what was their relationship like when they were the only ones? And have Diana say, no, of course you guys, are going to fight and you're going to come at odds. You're such great personalities. But she brings them together. And then, as Phil said, there's this great line about ending the conflict with love, but it's not like a weird pacifist way. It's not saying that fighting is a bad thing. It's just saying that fighting in this context doesn't make any sense. So to think that she united the world's finest in everything they're going to do, it just made me love these characters. I mean, if you change the names of these characters, I would read them every single month. Like, I love this so much.
I think that's the one thing I've seen with Darwyn's wonderful storytelling is that, some people rush to give you an end result. Darwyn has this amazing ability to resolve conflict in a page in 2 panels. That's the most amazing thing. He can just hit a point home right there within 2 panels, and you're like, oh, this just clicks instantaneously.
Just sort of while we're on the the depiction of the big three, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. So you mentioned the JLA classified issue. So DC New Frontier was a 6-issue miniseries. Each issue was lengthy.
64 pages.
But then when Warner Brothers put out the animated adaptation of New Frontier, they put out a comic book special as well to coincide with the release. And it consists of 3 stories. 2 of them are real quick. They're very fun.
You're absolutely right, except there's a 4th story. It is the very first page. It features the character Rip Hunter, who's kind of this proto-Doctor Who that DC invented during the 50s. And here he acts as the narrator. And I don't quite remember the context when this issue came out, but there are lines in here that I just really want to share because I think they continue to be timeless. The characters explaining which continuity does the story you're about to read exist in. And this is a conversation I've had with many different fans and friends over the years. And he says, is it in the version that you've read in the comics? Is it in the version that you're going to see on film? And Rip, who is a time traveler and kind of makes sense that he would say this, says, who cares? Who cares what reality it's in? There are an infinite number of realities. We call that fiction. And then he makes a joke, the camera pans out, so to speak, and you see him enjoying himself. And to me, this is one of the best single pages I've ever read because Darwyn Cooke is taking all of our arguments about what does and doesn't matter and saying, really none of it matters. It's a matter of what you get out of it and what you enjoy. And I just feel like that informs so much of the love he brings to this stuff. Like, he didn't worry about the details. He worried about what he got out of it, and he was able to convey that back to you. So I really just wanted to make sure that if you haven't read this page, please, I'm sure you can find it on Google. It's just great.
So you guys were talking about the the main story in that JLA one-shot with Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. And we talked about how, in the main New Frontier story, there's this whole bit about how Superman and Batman fake Superman's defeat when they battle. And this one-shot story gives you the background on that. And it's a great story. Zeroing back in on New Frontier, I mean, what are some of the other things that really made an impression on you? I mean, I'll say one thing for me is Cooke's depiction of the Barry Allen Flash, which is one of my favorite parts of the entire story. At the time, Barry Allen had not returned to life in the main DC continuity. That only happened just a couple of years ago. Wally West was my Flash. He's still my Flash. But at that point, I mean, I hadn't read any Barry stories. I mean, I only knew Wally as the Flash. And this made me a Barry fan. I mean, don't ever mess with my Iris. It's, one of my favorite Barry moments, one of my favorite New Frontier moments. It's just perfect. And that whole sequence with Captain Cold, stopping the bombs from going off and creating the snowfall, all of it. I mean, I just loved it.
Well, and having grown up with it, the Carmine Infantino and Gardner Fox and John Broome Flash was very much a scientist. I mean, almost a dispassionate scientist. He was a thinking man's hero. But in this, the love he had for Iris and his protection and his fear if she was going to be hurt, like you said, don't ever mess with my Iris. That was fantastic. That really showed the humanity. And even later on in the book, I liked it when Barry showed all his anxiety and his sense of inferiority against Superman.
It's also genuine. It's not starting with the superhero, it's starting with the man. I mean, one of the reasons I'm enjoying the Flash TV show so much is it's kind of reminiscent of Spider-Man, and I saw a lot of Peter Parker in this version of Barry Allen. I'm like Desi. Wally West was my Flash. I had to learn to like Barry Allen, and watching him look at this from a human perspective and say, I love her. She's the only reason I keep a secret identity. She's the reason later on in the book he temporarily resigns from active duty. It's driven by real human needs and not just out there superhero stuff, and it's so well done.
It's just a substance. There's a substance to the power, because without that, there's nothing. I mean, you can't tell a story. That's what makes Superman stories that I read, like All-Star or anything of that nature.
Yeah.
You're telling the humanity behind these superheroes. Even though Superman's quote-unquote not human, his emotions are that of a human being, and that's what drives the person. The powers are completely secondary.
Yeah, it's like John Jones and King Faraday playing chess.
Yes.
It's like you could leave at any time. He's like, why would I want to? I'm going to get through to you. And then when they finally do at the end, that is the most, quote-unquote commie basher guy in the world and a guy from Mars, and they're teaming up to fight the island of the dinosaurs. It's like only in superhero comics.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons why this story is a favorite of ours and has been a favorite of so many comic book fans, and we've hit on a lot of them already, but I think the humanity that Cooke showed of all of these characters, I think more than anything else, that's what has elevated this story.
So basically, like when King Faraday talks to John, he says, you can leave any time. There's this great visual sequence where Faraday lights a cigarette, And when he tries to put it in his mouth, he sees this realization where this guy is saying, I'm not a murderer. It would have diminished me to let another creature die unnecessarily. And he's telling this to Kings, you are not an evil. You are not evil within your mind. I can see that your struggle is good. And the cigarette from King's mouth falls off and falls to the ground. That he had a realization that, this quote-unquote hideous alien creature actually has a heart and has a humanity to it in terms of its emotion, that they're not cold, murderous creatures in the universe.
Yeah, he is not in his traditional Martian Manhunter, guys. I mean, it's very important to point out, Darwyn Cooke drew him not only as an otherworldly being, but really, unlike any depiction I've seen before, this is a creature. I mean,
grotesque.
It goes out of its way. I mean, he's got like 3 or 4 strange digits, and Jean could change at any time, but he doesn't. He sits here and he goes, you need to understand that the world is filled with people who don't necessarily are like you, but that doesn't change the fact that they're good people.
I mean, if you look at it, like you have this grotesque creature telling a human being that, in your heart, you honestly believe there will be a better day when all of this won't be needed. To find that within you, King Faraday, it has filled my heart with hope. Like, it's just a human interaction at the end of the day. Yes, they might be different creatures, different worlds, but this is just beautiful storytelling.
Yeah, and John is another beautiful example of the outsider and the immigrant. I mean, people always say Superman is an immigrant, but he arrived as a child. I mean, he was raised here. Diana came in as an adult, and Jean came even later in his life. I mean, later on we'll find out he had kids and wives and everything else back on Mars. But when Jean arrives here, he is trying to make the best of a bad situation. And for him to kind of say, well, listen, I'm going to help you with your stuff too, it just shows how strong of a character he is, but also unique. I don't think any other member of the Justice League could have played that scene as believably well. And to see the reaction on Faraday's face where he's this hard ass to all the other characters, and Jean is able to just get through to him with love, it's great to read.
I put this in the email I sent you guys, but it's like, how has there not been a Martian Manhunter series or miniseries where he's, a detective modeled after, these movie stars that he sees, and, just like really corny and spouting these catchphrases.
Oh, Mickey Spillane.
Yeah, I mean, the way he's depicted here, I loved it. And again, another example of making me a fan out of a character who I didn't really have much, if any, affinity for prior.
You had asked what we like about the story. I think what takes a little bit more time to appreciate is how there's an appearance, and every single character published in 1959 or 1960 is in the story in some way, and they all add to it. I mean, you got the Blackhawks, you've got the Challengers of the Unknown,
you have the Sea Devils,
the Sea Devils. You got Professor Haley. You got Nathaniel Adam as a pilot before it was Captain Adam. You've got the Losers, Task Force,
Viking Prince, right?
Viking Prince
in the flashback. I mean, how holistic can you be?
Yeah, so he included all of them. He used Ace Morgan as a contrast to Hal. Ace was the macho 50s crew cut, live hard, drink hard, play hard. And then Hal's more the modern man. He was in touch with his feelings. He's compassionate. The post-traumatic stress syndrome that Phil brought up. So it's a juxtaposition of 2 different eras and 2 different generations.
Another thing that you mentioned, Rich, was, and we hit on this before too, but just how expansive it is and how Cooke works in everybody. And I am curious. Again, I know overall we enjoyed it, but Phil, you mentioned before how initially it was a little off-putting how much it jumped around, and it does. I mean, it's not like we're following one character through this. I don't know. I wonder if sometimes maybe I would have preferred if certain characters hadn't made the cut. I know in my email I said, like, I could have done without the Challengers of the Unknown. And as I was writing it, I said, I know Mike is going to jump on this. And you felt the opposite. For me, I guess it's more of the DC characters that I was already familiar with, like, Flash and Green Lantern and Martian Manhunter, that I maybe would have wanted more of, and maybe a little less of some of the other characters.
I think it's a question of time. Things happen during that era which need to be touched on. And the reason that I really like the Challengers of the Unknown being included here is not just because they're these proto-Jack Kirby characters, but because they are a contrast to the Justice Society that came before and the Justice League that came later. They have no secret identities. They've survived terrible, terrible tragedy, and they are the go-to super people in an era where the response team is government-backed, because everyone who wears a mask, everyone who's an outsider is considered a potential threat. But they don't work, and to your point, they're not around today. There's no version of the Challengers of the Unknown I recommend to someone. They're quickly replaced by the Justice League, which are big, costumed, colorful outsiders. And I feel like the incredible nature of them and their stories is made better when you compare them to what the government said we should allow during the 50s, the Challengers, the Suicide Squad, these other people who were very down to earth, but at the end they couldn't accomplish as much as the people who came before and after.
But I think the issue is, I guess, when you're a young reader, you start out this mega epic, miniseries, and you have these unknown characters. I'm a young kid. When we read this,
You're still a young kid.
I know. I can't help it. When you have Superman, Batman, these are the prominent DC characters, and you start your series out with these characters called the losers. I have no idea who they are. So, when I'm reading this dinosaur story,
but you do now, right?
I do now, but it's also appreciating the story itself. Like these guys are sacrificing themselves because, quote unquote, their team name says it all. So you appreciate it more. But if you're of a younger age demographic, it might be just tougher to get into, and that's what possibly happened when I read it the first time.
Yeah, same here, same for me. I could not have cared less about the losers when I read this originally, but now I go back to this story all the time.
Yeah.
For a while, I really liked the animated because I thought it was more succinct and it cut some of the fat out. Now I'm starting to realize letting that breathe and having all those background characters, having the Viking Prince, having Adam Strange, having Nathaniel Adam, having the Challengers.
Having Leslie Tompkins, having background characters that wouldn't be introduced till decades later.
That made me appreciate more the sprawling macro. I think they're each tremendously good for different reasons, and you should look at them that way. That would be my vote.
Especially they're both written by the same guy. I agree. Like, it is great to have both of them.
And a heck of a voice cast. I mean, if anyone listening to this hasn't taken time to watch that movie, Neil Patrick Harris is Barry Allen, David Boreanaz is Hal Jordan,
Lucy Lawless is Wonder Woman.
Yeah, the gentleman who does Vandal Savage in the Justice League cartoon, I think does King Faraday. It's a great movie. It's aged very well, and I mean, Cooke, my favorite Cooke work of all time is the work he did on Batman Beyond, the cartoon show. So seeing him be heavily involved with the New Frontier movie, I think it's the best direct-to-DVD movie DC's ever made.
Yeah, and it's so concise and so succinct. What I thought, one scene that I loved, again, it holds up in both mediums, is Batman confronting John Jones with the match. But the thing I thought was unique in the DVD was when Batman and John Jones are in the Batcave, and John Jones is going, hey, here's this. I've had it. I'm moving on. And Batman has so much disdain. He doesn't even turn around and look at him. He keeps his back to him the whole time.
Yeah, it was much better done in the movie. I agree. I found myself rereading the book and thinking, oh, wait, why is that? Why does that work so well in the movie? And then I remember Darwyn Cooke wrote the movie too. It's amazing to see someone work on both of these so close to each other.
Yeah, I mean, the animated movies definitely was one of the things that I wanted to get into because it is one of my favorites of the adaptations. As I'm sure you guys and a lot of listeners, I mean, I was a huge fan of the Bruce Timm, the animated series, Batman, Superman, Justice League, Batman Beyond. The direct-to-DVD animated movies that they've been doing over the past few years, I feel they're very hit or miss. For me, usually more of a miss. Really only a few that have really resonated with me. But New Frontier is definitely one of them. New Frontier was the second one that they did, if I remember correctly. They did Superman Doomsday first. Recently, they've started doing longer movies. So Dark Knight Returns, for example, when they adapted that, they did it in 2 movies. So they really were able to cover everything. New Frontier was one of those, though, where they have a very strict 75-minute time limit. I know for a lot of fans, they probably wish that this movie had been longer and that more elements from the book had been incorporated. I think it definitely, certain moments could have used a little more time to breathe. I mean, because I rewatched it just the other night, and I mean, it's fast. It does jump around. As much as the book jumps around, this jumps around even more.
And it's funny, I watched it just last night, but I had the same observation. Boy, it jumps very quickly, scene to scene to scene.
Yeah.
2 things I'll say. I agree with you. I wish possibly it could have been 15 minutes longer. I don't know if you had made it 2, like a Batman.
Right.
I don't know if it would have been better. I think I don't think it would have been as good. Again, to me, limits make the artist. I wish this thing could have had another 10 minutes more than it did.
Yeah, I agree. But they did trim away a lot of the fat and really got to. I think they focused more on the characters that I guess probably they figured most viewers would be more familiar with.
They also branded it as Justice League, the New Frontier.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, it actually works really well because you get to the end and it's almost like, oh, hey, I want to see that battle set in 1960 where they fight Starro. I'm still waiting for that.
You hit on this before, how there were some other differences, not just things that were omitted, but things that were shifted. So, for example, that scene between Batman and John Jones, in the comic, it takes place on the roof of the GCPD under the bat signal. In the movie, it takes place in the Batcave.
And the mere fact that he just wouldn't even give him the dignity of looking at him and just kept his... I thought that was so powerful.
But one of the other major differences that I really like in the movie is that the movie added what I think is a really critical and sorely lacking scene that wasn't in the book.
With Lois.
With Superman and Lois.
Up on the Daily Planet.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Because, in the book, Superman, all of his interaction, or a lot of his interaction, is with Wonder Woman. And it's a great dynamic and a great relationship. But when you get to the end of the book and Superman is rescued by Aquaman, and Aquaman's like, hey, I have him. He's been asking for someone named Lois. It's a great moment. But when there hasn't been any interaction between Superman and Lois throughout the whole story, as comic book fans, yeah, we know their great love story. But I really think that connection point is needed, and I like that the movie added it.
Well, for me, when I looked at A New Frontier, if I may interrupt, basically when Wonder Woman's in the hospital, she kisses Superman, right? You're like, oh, what's going on? But then in the next few pages, Superman says, my best friend is there. So they kind of established it in just that quick scenario that, you know what, they are friends. Even though she kissed him, it's a little confusing what's happening, but then he says, my best friend is in, recovering. And then final page where, he asked for Lois, and it's like, that scene where everyone wants to cry, and it's like, this is that moment. So that's how, I guess in printed page, that's the best way he could have done it.
That's an excellent point. I hadn't even noticed that.
Yeah.
Could we go around the table real quick and give your favorite quote? What you remember?
Well, I've already given mine that, don't ever mess with my iris. I guess if there's another one, it's funny. I think all my favorite moments have to do, maybe I'm just a romantic at heart, but...
You really are. I was going to point that out later, but you are a romantic, my friend.
Because I love when Hal says goodbye to Carol before he goes into battle, and he kisses her, and it's the...
the backdrop against the jet engine.
It's beautiful. And then he waits until he hears the roar of the jet engine, and he knows that Carol can't hear him. And he says, and he also waits until he has the helmet on, and he says, "I love you." So just the idea of how brave he is in most situations, but not in matters of the heart. I love that. And then of course the whole, this one has been asking for Lois. So yeah, there's definitely a common thread through my favorite lines. But those are mine. I mean, what while these two look up theirs, what would you say yours is, Rich?
I thought it was fascinating the way when Batman confronted John Jones, quote, "With you, all I need is a penny for a book of matches."
This is the world's greatest detective, and it doesn't mean that he can't hold his own in a fist fight, and that he can't stand alongside all of the what we would traditionally call superheroes. But this is a smart man, and this is a man who's not afraid to kind of use his intelligence to his advantage. I mean, the scene with John, it's jarring for me because he's meeting with a character that will become the Martian Manhunter, a teammate of his, and he's basically threatening him. He's basically saying, if you hurt the people of this world, which
I'll take you
care
out
very dearly about, I'm going to take you out. And guess what? It's not even going to be that difficult. you've crossed the vast gulf of space to be here, but I'm going to take you out. But over the course of this book, we see him warm to him, and we see them fight together. And at the end, it's one of those things where, if you were reading Justice League in 1959, maybe you said, oh, okay, it makes sense that all the superheroes would be together. But reading it today, it's like, oh, they earned this. They really came together after struggle. I mean, New Frontier is essentially the origin story of the Justice League of America.
So, Mike and Phil, your favorite lines?
There's so many. I just said a few, but the one that I really liked was when Flash goes through the center with the shrinking thing, and basically as he's about to fall, he says... I did it. I let my final arc carry me over the water. Live or die, I don't care. I did it. And the last thing I see is an angel of mercy, and you just see Wonder Woman coming. It was such a well-established way to describe Wonder Woman. She is not a bloodthirsty, barbarian Amazonian. She has love in her heart. She cares. And just to describe her as the angel of mercy, oh my God, I was like, I'm done. This is it. This is a perfect way to describe her.
Yeah, the way that Cooke utilizes other characters to describe characters we already know is amazing. Because it's like, how do they view them when they're all standing next to each other? It's just, I forgot about that scene. Good call.
That's a great point. And what about you for a favorite line?
Yeah, so my favorite line... I don't know. It's kind of weird, but it really, really stuck with me. I read it several times when I was going over my reread. It's in the very first issue when Rick Flag and Johnny Cloud have finally found each other on Dinosaur Island, and Johnny is sticking with the mission. He says, I am here to get you off of this island. And he says, get your squad, we're leaving. And he doesn't have a boat or anything else. And Rick Flag looks at him and he pulls out a bunch of dog tags. And he says, my squad, why, they're right here in my pocket. So if you've got a way off this rock, we'd all be happy to move out. And it's a small moment, but it really drives this character home. And it reminded me why I enjoy the rest of this, because Darwyn is so good at writing superheroes, but he's good at all different genres. He's such a good creative power. Like this particular line, one of the reasons I liked it so much is I'm a big fan of Garth Ennis, and he writes a lot of war comics. I've read a tremendous amount of war comics by that man, and there's always lines in here that make you really feel for veterans and active servicemen. And when I read this, I said, oh, that's one of the reasons I enjoy New Frontier so much. He's working muscles that go in different genres, and this drove that home for me. And it was a nice contrast to the first time I read this, when the Wednesday, the very first issue came out all those years ago, where I probably skipped right over this because I wanted superheroes and escape. Mm-hmm. This is grounded in reality, even though they're on what is essentially Jurassic Park.
Like, if I can say one more line, there's so many great lines. You can't pick one, you know that. The second one, as he mentioned with the veterans, is the line that Hal Jordan says about Korea, where he said, but Korea forced me to find out what would make me survive. Mm-hmm. I would kill to survive, and we have to kill this creature. So, I mean, it's showing that, maybe Superman, because he's been in this, in the business for so long, he knows maybe he can find an alternative. When you're a young, budding superhero, you have your black and white, and you're like, for my survival, I have to kill.
It's do or die.
Yeah,
it's binary.
Yeah. And he's been in war, so, he's a soldier, so he understands the necessity of killing, why you kill. So that another great line,
Speaking of the center, the villain in this piece, I mean, I had mentioned this in my email, but, so we're set in a time of Cold War paranoia, and you have this villain that's infecting everyone with fear and doubt and all of that. So, not the most subtle, but Mike, you actually had an interesting rebuttal to that. Not that I was saying it as a negative, but just more of an observation.
No, I thought it was really effective because, again, I tried to imagine what a villain that could have united all these foes would have been like in 59 when these books came out. And I thought the center was appropriate because it seemed like the type of, I don't want to say generic foe, but, back then you didn't have as many repeat antagonists as you had today. So to me, the center was like, okay, it's big, there's a lot of stuff to hit, there's a lot of stuff to throw at you, and at the end of the story it goes away. It almost felt like something that would have been published at that time. I think about the stories back then, and there's a lot of like Batman sci-fi stories, and they fight these ridiculous one-off alien menaces, and they're so out there, they're so like an Outer Limits cast off from there, and to see them all fight this character, the center, almost felt like, yeah, that's period appropriate. Today it might be a little weird, but for that period of time, it's like, yeah, we're all going to fight Dinosaur Island. All right, let's go. Let's move ahead on that. My favorite thing about New Frontier is it's essentially a story about the comic book industry. So I always tend to tell people, comics are great, superhero comics are even better, but the history of the medium is probably one of the best stories. Like, you have Titans, you have Deception, you have back and forth, you just have so much good stuff. This comic book takes you from the end of not only World War II, but the end of the height of superhero popularity. And it ends with the birth of the Silver Age, which we all know pretty much starts with, Justice League #1, the Return of the Flash. These are set points in time. And he uses fictional versions of real-world events to show you what was going on. Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman were consistently published in the 50s. They never diminished in popularity, and that's reflected here in the fact that they never go away, and they have to shepherd a new generation of superheroes. The McCarthy hearings in this book, and that have been showcased other places, including James Robinson's The Golden Age, I mean, that's very reminiscent to me of Dr. Wortham and the seduction of the innocent and all the stuff that really happened in the real world. This book reflects, in a way, what the industry and the genre actually went through. So when you get to that last page, and I keep mentioning the fight with Starro, like, I've never even read All-Star #3, but when I see them fight this alien, this almost Lovecraftian threat, they have earned that. The industry has earned that. I mean, yeah, maybe across the street they were making the Fantastic Four and everything else, but Darwyn Cooke has done his job and made you love these characters, even though during the 50s you probably wouldn't have cared about any of them. So that is my favorite part about New Frontier.
I didn't realize this, but it one thing I do want to bring up, I did not like it at the beginning, the visual layout, the 3 panels per page, because you look at a lot of other stuff, it's much, much more dynamic, altered, angular, they might not even have panels, but this grew on me, and it fostered a real consistency and continuity such that when I got at the end, it just seemed right.
Yeah, that was something, I don't think I noticed that the first time that I read this. It came out in 2004. I was in high school. I mean, I was savvy enough, but I don't know that I really was paying attention to the layout. But in subsequent readings, and especially in preparing for this, yeah, it really did jump out at me. It's almost exclusively the 3 panels per page. Every now and then you get that splash page, and it really feels earned. And then there are only really a couple of double-page spreads. Is the first one when they show the center for the first time?
I think it is,
I just realized that 3 panel. Wow.
Yeah, and there's another one where it's all in black and white, as if you were sitting at home and you were watching this on the grainy news footage. There's the one at the end where it's the quote-unquote the right stuff, and Ace Morgan is literally putting on his aviator shades, and it's just, it hits you like, yes, you've earned that. We've all earned that. This is not an early Image book. This is a master of the craft. Look at this.
Yeah.
I want to just take another moment to talk about Darwyn Cooke. I remember when he passed away, not too recently. I remember reading the news, and it was very strange because it really, really upset me. I can't imagine what his friends and family are going through, but he was great. He was really, really good. I mean, this may be his most well-known work, but please, if you're listening to this and you've never read Parker or His Spirit or any of his other stuff, please do yourself a favor. Catwoman. Get it. It's so good. There's a page that I'm looking at right now from the Absolute, and it's the normal 3-panel grid, but Cooke was very good at being able to tell a story with the panels. And what I mean by that is there is motion, even in his still images. It's something you see a lot with Jack Kirby. It's not easy to do. Cooke makes me appreciate art. A couple of years ago, I think he did variant covers for every book that came out from DC that month, and it was the first time in my adult life that I was just buying random DC books because I would look at a cover and I would see an entire story in a single panel. If you can look up online, the cover for Grayson, Dick Grayson is falling through a shaft, and each one of the bombs around him is counting down at a different number. You're being told the entire story right there, and it's amazing. It's a single static image, but it's just great to look at. You've seen this stuff on posters. You've seen this stuff on other people's walls. He was amazing, and he did Batman Beyond. He worked in animation. He had a varied career. Like, it's all good, and it's just, like, we're all worse for him being gone.
Yeah, it was truly a rare talent that the industry lost. And certainly, again, to echo what you said, I mean, certainly for his friends and family, we continue to offer our condolences. All right, well, I thank you all very much for being part of this special book club episode of My Comic Shop History. I hope listeners enjoyed this comic book talk. Keep tuning in for future episodes. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the show. Don't be a flat squirrel. My Comic Shop History is a Flat Squirrel production. Please visit flatsquirrelproductions.com to explore my other projects, including My Comic Shop documentary, By Spoon, the Jay Mizell story, and the forthcoming Wacky Man, The Rise of a Puppeteer. Be sure to subscribe to My Comic Shop History on iTunes and catch up on Season 1. Like My Comic Shop History on Facebook and follow me on Twitter at DesiWestside. Likes, ratings, and reviews are always greatly appreciated. Thank you for listening and continuing to support this show.